Friends, today it is the 22nd edition of LETILS, that is Legal Empowerment Through Interaction Lecture Series. Today we are fortunate to have Justice Jayashankaran Nambiar. He will be dealing with the subject Judicial Control of Delegated Legislation, the Indian Experience. Sir, over to you.
Well, good afternoon, all of you. I can see that the pandemic has taken its toll on most of you, because rather than spend a good Friday afternoon with your families, you're sitting here waiting for a boring lecture in administrative law. Anyway, before I begin the lecture, I just want to clarify that there are some reasons as to why I chose this particular topic, just in case you're wondering. Why did I choose a topic on administrative law? And even if I had to choose something in administrative law, why did I choose delegated legislation? I have my own reasons, and those reasons are as follows. One, I believe that for a successful practice in law in our country, one needs to have a firm grounding in three aspects of law. That's not to say that you don't need to study anything else, but irrespective of the branch in which you're specializing in, a student of law, a practitioner of law, and a judge must have a thorough grounding on the principles of constitutional law, administrative law, and interpretation of statutes. These three are common ground for any practice, and therefore, irrespective of whether you're a civil lawyer, criminal lawyer, company lawyer, tax lawyer, these three grounds will hold you in good. These three areas of law would definitely hold you in good stead in the practice of law in our country. So that's the first reason why I chose administrative law. The reason I'm choosing to stick to the delegated legislation is multiple. One, I come across a lot of cases in court where lawyers appear before me and they're challenging some delegated legislation or the other. Sometimes they don't know whether what they are challenging is a delegated legislation or not. The distinction between an administrative order and a delegated legislation in the form of a rule or a circular is critical for formulating the grounds of challenge. Thirdly, I find that there are certain concerns which I have personally with regard to the development of law in this particular branch or particular area. And as a last, towards the end of my lecture, I would probably just share those concerns with you so that you can also, it acts like a food for thought for all of you. Now, administrative law generally, I need to have some, need to give you some background as to what the development of administrative law has been historically, before we understand the true contours of delegated legislation as a concept of administrative law. Now, if you look at the history of administrative law, why did we ever have a body of principles which come under the broad category of administrative law? We had this because originally governance was entirely by the state as a concept. The state would discharge all the functions necessary for a society to be governed. But that soon became difficult, and it was found necessary for the state to actually divest itself of a lot of those functions and give it to the private enterprise initially. And you must also bear in mind that universally, the laissez-faire doctrine had come into prominence in the early 19th century. And this meant that you were to give most of the functions of governance to the private enterprise so that they would be free from governmental control. And this was seen as a way forward as regards governance of any society. But as you all know, that soon fell into disrepute. People did not want to be exploited, which they were when the private enterprise took over. And therefore, we see closer to the second half of the 19th century, we find there is a shift back to government taking over most of the functions. But this time around, when the government actually takes over functions, you would require a protection of the civil liberties of the citizens and the rights of the citizens. And therefore, you need some degree of control over the governmental actions when it affects the common man or the citizen. So it is for this purpose that you find the body of principles that have been developed, which essentially try to restrict or put limitations on the exercise of power by the government. There is also a second aspect, which is basically empowering the government or requiring the government to take positive action in certain cases for the welfare of the citizen. So it is both these principles of limitation of power as well as directing the government to take positive action that form the body of principles which we now refer to as administrative law. Now, when you talk about administrative law and the administration for the purposes of governance, we normally have three categories of administrative authorities who are under a statute. Now, every legislature comes out with the legislation. Under the legislation, you would have the authorities who are to implement the objects of the statute. And those would come broadly under these three categories who we call the administrative authorities, which are quasi-legislative authorities. So these are what we will be dealing with today. Quasi-legislative authorities are persons who are doing or discharging legislative functions but are not exactly the legislature. Now, when I use these words, legislature, legislation, executive, etc., you must keep at the back of your mind the fundamental concept of separation of powers that informs our constitution and our governance. So our constitution, as you all know, adopts the principle of separation of powers. It is, in some decisions, it has been treated as a basic feature of our constitution. The difference between a strict separation of powers, the strict separation of powers as advocated by many of the earlier jurists and philosophers like Montesquieu, etc., we do not follow. We have an altered system of checks and balances governing our separation of powers. Now, the separation of powers would require that legislation must be only by a legislative body, the implementation of the laws must be by the executive, and in the event of any conflict or in the event of any question regarding the rights of the citizens, that has to be addressed by the judiciary. Now, quasi-legislative, therefore, is a phrase used for the purposes of determining the powers of an authority vested by a statute with legislative powers or limited legislative powers. In the same vein, we refer to quasi-judicial authorities, which is again an administrative authority who is vested with limited powers of adjudicating upon the inter se rights of citizens or the right of a citizen vis-a-vis the government. And then you have a third category, which is purely administrative authorities who do not discharge either a legislative function or a fraction of the judicial function, but who are merely implementing authorities of the objects or the directions of the statute. So these are broadly the three categories. And as I said earlier, today we are confined only with the quasi-legislative authorities. Now, delegated legislation, if one were to look for a definition, the classic definition you would find in the Halsbury's Laws of England, where it's a very simple definition and it conveys the meaning very clearly. It says, when an instrument of a legislative nature is made by an authority in exercise of a power delegated under a statute, it is called delegated legislation or subordinate legislation. It's as simple as that. You have a statute, you have a power conferred therein on a particular authority. He is empowered to legislate or bring about an instrument of a legislative nature. If there is such a power and if there is such an instrument, that instrument is called a delegated legislation. Now, is there a requirement of delegated legislation? This is a big question that is often asked, because if you look at the strict or even the principle of separation of powers, delegated legislation appears to be a contradiction in terms, and it seems to be anathema to the constitutional principle of separation of powers, because you would not expect anybody other than a legislature to be actually legislating. But if you look at the complexities of administration or governance in today's societies, you will soon realize that no legislature can be expected to legislate with the kind of details required for effective administration. And therefore, every legislative body has to resort to a delegation of at least some of its functions. In other words, while they may carve out or they may spell out the broad contours on which the legislation is framed. The nitty-gritty, the minute details would have to be delegated to another authority who can in turn, who is probably more aware of the ground realities or the ground, in a particular area where the legislation is supposed to operate, and come out with the details regarding those and frame the rules for effective implementation. So it is what we would call a necessary evil. If you were to see delegation of legislative functions as an evil when compared with the constitutional scheme of separation of powers. Now, the one pitfall that you normally find in terms of practice by lawyers is that when you're talking about delegated legislation, it is very easy to get confused with an actual instrument of delegated legislation and certain other instruments which may not actually be an instrument that is a result of an exercise of a legislative power. Let me make that clear. You have various terms referring to purported delegated legislations. Some of you may refer to rules, some call it regulations, some call it circulars, some call it notices, some call it guidelines. There is also some people refer to it as codes. So what are these? First of all, it's necessary to understand what these instruments are, because simply because it is called a rule, it need not be a delegated legislation. There's no magic in the nomenclature used. And therefore, what you have to first and foremost in your challenge, or if you're confronted with any order which is objectionable for your client, the first and foremost thing that you need to ask is, where is this traceable to? Is this a guideline? Is this an order? Is this a circular? And if so, is it traceable to the statute? Is it traceable to a power in the author of that instrument to issue such an instrument? If the answer to that question is no, it simply is got no force of law as far as the statute is concerned. So the first and foremost step is, do not go by the nomenclature. Look at the instrument, see whether it is traceable to the parent statute, see whether there is a power given to the authority who's issued that particular instrument to issue rules, to issue the instrument itself. If that power is missing, then it is not a delegated legislation, it is something else. And we'll come to that later. The distinction, however, between the two is crucial, because there are grounds on which you can challenge a delegated legislation which may not be available to you for challenge in an administrative order, which does not have the force of law. For example, a simple instance would be, suppose there is a violation of natural justice. If there is a violation of natural justice, you may use that as a ground to challenge an administrative order, but you cannot use it for a challenge to the delegated legislation, because principles of natural justice do not inform the delegation of legislation unless the parent statute expressly says that the natural justice principles must be observed. For example, a straight example that comes to mind would be under the Motor Vehicles Act, the Central Motor Vehicles Act. The Act says that the state government can prepare rules or schemes, but before preparing a scheme, there has to be a consultation with the stakeholders. So that would be a case where a scheme is framed, it is a part of delegated legislation, and there is a requirement of consultation, there's a requirement of natural justice to be followed before the scheme comes in and becomes a valid scheme and has an operation in law. So that distinction, please bear in mind before we proceed further, because when you use the word guideline, circular, rules, etc., regulations, there's no magic in these terms per se. You have to go behind the words. Like you talk about conveyancing, there's no magic in the use of the word lease or license. You have to go beyond, and you have to go behind the instrument to see whether the ingredients of those manners of conveyance are actually satisfied, or the definitions are satisfied. Now, before we go further, I also want to talk a little bit about another pitfall that faces most lawyers, which is the distinction between a delegated legislation and a conditional legislation. Now, you may ask what a conditional legislation is and delegated legislation. The answer is very simple. In the case of delegated legislation, there is a delegation of the legislative power by the main legislature in favor of the delegate. And the rules or regulations that are made by the delegate are an exercise of the delegated power of legislation. In the case of conditional legislation, there is no delegation of a legislative power. The legislation is complete at the hands of the parent, at the hands of the main legislative body. You may find an authority that is delegated with a certain power, but that power is not a power of legislation. It is a power incidental to legislation, and it could be, as I would give you examples where the legislations have been held to be conditional legislations. It is basically delegating a power to the authority to determine certain aspects with regard to the area of operation of a particular legislation, the extent or the period for which the legislation is to operate, etc., etc. I'll come to those examples straight away. You have basically two decisions which I would recommend for reading. One is King Emperor versus Banwarilal Sharma, which is AIR 1945 Privy Council 48. And the second is Inder Singh versus State of Rajasthan, which is AIR 1957 Supreme Court 510.
So can you just repeat those two citations for the benefit of the participants?
First one is King Emperor versus Banwarilal Sharma, AIR 1945 Privy Council 48. And the second is Inder Singh versus State of Rajasthan, AIR 1957 Supreme Court 510.
Thank you.
Now, in the first case, it was basically what came up for consideration was the Governor General's ordinance with regard to constitution of special courts. The delegated power therein under the main statute was essentially to extend the duration of the ordinance to provincial governments, duration of the ordinance in cases of emergency, and the power was to be exercised by the provincial governments concerned. So look at what it says. There is a legislation which constitutes special courts for dealing with certain category of offences. Under the statute, there is a provision which enables the provincial government to extend the operation of the ordinance in certain specified circumstances. Now, if you look at the legislation and all the object of the legislation, the broad parameters, the policy, the implementation, the procedure, everything is mentioned, covered by the legislature. There is nothing that is left to the delegate in terms of legislative power. What is left to the delegate is only a limited function of extending it in certain contingencies. And that is what is called conditional legislation. It is not the same as delegated legislation. The second case will make it even more clear. That case concerned the Rajasthan Tenants Protection Ordinance. It was promulgated initially for a period of 2 years, but there was a provision therein given to the governor to extend the term of the ordinance for a further period. Now, this again, it was a case of a power given to the governor to extend the term of the ordinance for a further period in the event of an emergency, and the governor could exercise that power. Now, there is no exercise of a legislative power. It is only a mechanical exercise of the power of extension. So the legislation is complete even before the delegation, and there is no modicum of or residual legislative power that is given to the governor. So conditional legislations do not have to answer the limitations or do not have to be governed by the limitations that are normally in place for delegated legislation, for the simple fact that there is no delegation of the legislative power, and it is the legislative body that has actually brought out or exercised the legislative power for bringing out the legislation. So with that distinction between delegated legislation and conditional legislation, let's go on to what delegated legislation is. As I mentioned just before this, delegated legislation is when you have the exercise of a legislative power that is delegated to the delegate under a statute. Now, because this is an exception to the principle of separation of powers, you necessarily have to have limitations because our constitution frowns upon anything that is contrary to the the basic features of the constitution, and rightly so. But as I said earlier, a delegation is inevitable in today's complex world, and therefore it is necessary, and it's a necessary evil. So, what are the limitations that we have brought in for the purposes of controlling the delegation itself under the statute? One, and this is the main limitation, we have said through judicial dicta that the essential functions of legislation cannot be delegated. In other words, you cannot have the delegate exercising the actual legislation or legislative power, which is required to be exercised by the legislative body. So, I mean, that's pretty straightforward because, as I said, it's again stems from your basic feature of the constitution, which is the separation of powers. Only the legislature can legislate. And there is a reason why only the legislature should legislate, because the confidence of the people is in the representatives who together constitute the legislature. So the legislature must legislate. Legislature can delegate, but do not delegate the essential legislative functions. Now, what then is the delegate supposed to do? The delegate can only, what has come to be known as, fill in the blanks or fill in the details that are missing for the purpose of implementation of the statute. Now, two decisions which will drive home the point, and I've just taken two decisions because I mean the plethora of judgments will say the same thing, but it is the best exposition of the principles is in Mahi Beach Trading Company versus Union Territory of Pondicherry. The citation is 1996 3 SCC 741. 1996 3 SCC 741. And the second decision is Agricultural Market Committee versus Shalimar Chemical Works. And the citation is 1997 5 SCC 516. 1997 5 SCC 516. Now, the second decision, Agricultural Marketing Committee, the facts in that were like this. Under the Agricultural Marketing Committee, under the relevant statute, was given the power to levy a fee for sale and purchase of agricultural commodities within a notified area under the Act. Now, this was happening somewhere in Andhra Pradesh. What the Agricultural Committee did was they framed a set of rules which empowered the committee to levy a fee even in respect of goods that had come within the notified area from places, as in that case, from Kerala. So there were agricultural products which were purchased in Kerala, transported to the notified area in Andhra Pradesh, and the only activity that took place within the notified area was the packing and the grading of the or measurement of the agricultural produce. The question was whether twofold. One, whether the rules could be framed in such a manner as to authorize a levy of this particular fee in respect of this category of agricultural produce. And secondly, even if it was permitted, would that be ultra vires the basic provision of the statute? Now, the Supreme Court basically took the view that this would amount to, and if permitted, this would amount to a delegation of the excessive delegation of the legislative power, because the legislative power to impose a fee even in respect of the activities which were subjected to the levy in the notified area had to be by the legislative body and not by the delegate. So it was struck down on that principle. But even if it had passed the test of that, it would still have attracted the other doctrine of ultra vires, because they were obviously doing something that was not expressly guaranteed or expressly conferred on them. Now, the second limitation on delegated legislation is what we call the principle of non-delegate, which is, as you all know, delegate is non potest delegare. So when the statute delegates power to a particular authority, what is expected is that that particular authority alone will exercise the limited powers of legislation, and he will not subdelegate it to another authority. The only exception to that rule is where the statute itself permits the delegate to subdelegate. But that is pretty obvious even from the concept of delegation, because when a statutory delegation itself is an exception to the principle of separation of powers, then it doesn't need to be said that the delegate cannot further subdelegate. Now, the third limitation is that the delegation cannot confer greater powers on the delegate than on the parent the parent body, which is the legislature. Now, I'm referring to something which is notorious in England as also in other jurisdictions, and has come to be known as the Henry VIII Clause. Now, what this clause refers to is when you have a statute which has a clause therein delegating powers to a delegate, and those powers include the powers to modify or even repeal the original enactment. So you're basically handing over a knife to the delegate to chop off your own head. So this came to be referred to as the Henry VIII Clause, and it was named after the notorious monarch in England, Henry VIII, who was known for his autocratic rule. And what he did was very clever. He managed to somehow convince the parliament through a enactment of a statute of declarations that the monarch in England, under the statute, the monarch is given a power to make declarations which are binding on all these citizens. So what the legislature did not do, the monarch would do, and all the time covered under the provisions of the statute. So, because in England, Parliament is supreme, they don't have the written constitution that we do. So, the Parliament basically conferred a power on the monarch to do more than what they actually intended to do. And this was abused by the monarch, and it led to a very autocratic executive. And it came to be notoriously known as thereafter as the Henry VIII Clause.
Here it could be called the Bhasmasura Clause.
Bhasmasura Clause. The interesting aspect, though, is while under our constitution this is anathema, this is you cannot have these clauses. In England, it has been a tried and tested measure for many years, including, and it is not straight away struck down as bad, because there are many circumstances, there are many situations where the delegate must act in order to make the original statute in conformity with the subsequent statutes that are enacted. Now, this is a way that they devised for the purposes of ensuring that whenever there is another statute which comes in confrontation with the old statute, the authority, the delegate under the old statute, could step in and make amendments to the main parent statute so as to make them in conformity with the future legislations that came in subsequently. This avoided the cumbersome procedure that is required for amending a statute by the legislature itself. So the rule-making authority, armed with this power, could take a shortcut and amend the provisions of the statute. Now, England also ran into problems with these clauses after the European Community legislation became relevant for England. Now, the European Community legislation in England took the form of, like our constitutional mandate, because they never had a written constitution earlier. The Human Rights Act and the European Community legislations came to act as a super constitution for the British people. Of course, it remains to be seen what will happen now if the Brexit comes through. But otherwise, they are pretty much in a conundrum now because of the situation with the European Parliament. But in India, and our purposes, Henry VIII clauses are necessarily frowned upon. So we do not have a Bhasmasura in our midst. And lastly, when it comes to the limitation, of course, it's a common limitation which is applicable for all of administrative law and administrative and quasi-judicial and delegated legislation, the principle of ultra vires, beyond the powers of. So the delegate must act strictly in conformity with the objects of the parent statute. Now, there, the only rider is, when it comes to delegated legislation, you act in conformity not only with the provisions of the parent statute under which you are the delegate. Your delegated legislation, your delegated instrument, the rule, the regulation, or whatever you may call it, must also be in conformity with other plenary legislations, not only the statute under which this rule was framed, but also any other plenary legislation. For the simple reason that yours instrument is a subordinate legislation, and it must answer, or it must be in conformity, and it cannot go against the parent legislation, whichever be the parent legislation. It is as simple as the Indian Army, for example. You may be a lieutenant colonel in regiment A, but when a major general from any regiment comes there, you salute him. So it is irrespective of your regiment, irrespective of the statute under which you are created. When the plenary legislation, any other plenary legislation is there, and you find your rules to be not in conformity with that plenary legislation, your rules must give way to the plenary legislation.
So avoiding a collision course. Is it not?
Avoiding a collision. And in fact, you cannot even call it a collision, because it
Collision.
must simply,
I said collision course. Collision.
you cannot call it a collision also, because it is simply a subordination. You cannot collide.
I see.
And obviously, without needing to mention it, the subordinate legislation must also conform to the principles of the Constitution and the provisions of the Constitution. So these are the limitations with regard to delegated legislation. Now, what do we mean by control of delegated legislation?
May I ask one, whether there is a decision on that point?
On which?
Whether any other statute, it has to be in conformity with other statute, other plenary statute.
There are decisions. I think, I'm sorry, I don't have it off the cuff, but if I'm not mistaken, state of Tamil Nadu versus Sabhanayagam. You will have to excuse me for not providing you with the citation.
No, we will find it. We will find it out.
I think it is state of Tamil Nadu versus Sabhanayagam. Where, if I'm not mistaken, it is Jagannath Rao who laid down this principle. But even without those, I mean, you need not be bothered by precedents. Even without the principle is this: when you're talking about subordinate legislation, it is, as the name suggests, it is subordinate, and it is subordinate legislation. A subordinate legislation must necessarily be subject to plenary legislation, and that is the bedrock of our understanding of legislative powers.
Yes.
Right? Now, when we talk about control of delegated legislation, I know I'm supposed to be talking about judicial control of delegated legislation, but I want to make a point with regard to another control of delegated legislation, which is the legislative control of delegated legislation. Now, you may ask, what is the legislative control of delegated legislation? Because delegated legislation itself comes only from legislation. Now, legislative control is simply the control of delegated legislation through the very statute under which the delegated power of legislation is conferred. What I'm saying is, suppose you have a statute. The statutory provisions say that a particular authority is empowered to make rules under the statute. The same statute can also provide that when the rules are made, the rules shall not be made without consulting, without the delegate consulting those who are going to be affected. So a machinery for consultation before actually making the rule is basically controlling the manner of exercise of the power of delegation. So consultation is the first one. So at the draft stage of a rule, for example, there could be a requirement under the statute that whenever the rule-making authority makes a rule, prepare the rule in draft stage, put it out for publication, invite objections, look into those objections, and then finalize the rule. This is a degree of control over delegated legislation in the statute itself. Second, and most important, the requirement under the statute for laying rules before the legislative body. This is a very, very important control. And there's a reason why I'm saying this, and I'll come to that in a minute when we talk about judicial control. The principle of laying is essentially a control, and you need to understand that this is a control of delegated legislation for really emphasizing upon the importance of the procedure. What do you mean by laying? Yeah, laying can be of different sorts. It can be laying through a positive resolution, laying through negative resolution, etc. Essentially, what it requires is when the rule-making authority makes a rule, before it becomes operational in law, you have to lay it before the legislative body which has empowered you to make the rule. When you go do that, the legislative body gets an opportunity to look at the rule and see whether it is in conformity with the objects of the act which they've legislated upon. And the rule does not stray or does not suffer from any of the defects which would be pointed out by courts if the legislature does not do it. So it's a first stage check against an excessive exercise of power by the delegate. And this is important because you're doing this, it is showing a sense of responsibility of the legislative body itself in the making of a subordinate legislation. And that is paramount, that is necessary. There is also a control exercise through a requirement of publishing or publication of the rules. Now you would find the provisions in the statute which say that every rule that is made and laid before the House, and after the stipulated period it becomes law, it must be published in a manner either specified in the statute itself, say by official gazette or something, or through a reasonable method of publication. Why would you have a reasonable method of publication? Because in our country, you still follow the principle of ignorance of law not being an excuse. So if citizens who are governed by rules and law, because a rule would also come under the definition of law under Article 13 of the Constitution. So if you want the citizen or the public to be aware of the law, it is incumbent upon you to publish this, because the citizen cannot tomorrow take a stand that I did not know of the law. So you have to prevent the citizen from taking a stand that you did not do anything to make the law known to me. And therefore publication is an essential attribute of fair administration, and you have to insist on it. That is why most statutes insist on publication. Now, there is one more method which is growingly resorted to in most countries, including Britain and America, which is that, and recently in India also, and it's a welcome trend, where the legislative body itself constitutes subcommittees to monitor delegated legislation. So the legislative body shows its sense of responsibility wherever a delegate is asked to bring out a statutory instrument of delegated legislation. The subcommittee then goes and looks at the rule or regulation and ensures that it is in conformity with the objects of the statute. Now, in lighter vein, it's a different matter whether these bodies actually go and do these functions. But theoretically, these are all in place.
Seldom exercised.
Seldom exercised. That's the bane of the thing, and those are the concerns that I want to address you on a little later. Now, let me come now to judicial control. And judicial control, once you have understood the concepts that I've earlier dealt upon, judicial control becomes very easy to understand, because judicial control of delegated legislation is pretty much on the same lines as what judicial control over administrative action itself. So you're basically monitoring the limitations which I mentioned earlier. You're looking as to whether the delegate, there has been an excessive delegation to the delegate. First test. If that is done, then the next question is, has the delegate delegated further? No. Is the delegate conferred with greater powers? Is it a Henry VIII clause? If the answer to that is no, then you go on to the next. What is the delegate doing? How is, in the making of the rules, has he exceeded his powers? The question of ultra vires. If that is answered in the affirmative that, or in the negative, it is not ultra vires, then you look at the legality, the principles of review of judicial review of administrative action, illegality, irrationality, procedural impropriety, and now proportionality. So, and of course, on the question of unreasonableness also, you apply the test of Wednesbury unreasonableness. Now, illegality is straightforward. You just see whether it has exceeded the powers, it is illegal. Irrationality, you're talking about reasonableness. We'll come to that along with Wednesbury unreasonableness. You're basically asking the question as to whether the delegate has taken into account the relevant factors, whether he has ignored the irrelevant factors, and even if he has done both this, he has come to a conclusion which is not seen as completely arbitrary or unreasonable by a common man or by anybody who knows the object of the act and the scope of the decision-making power. Procedural impropriety, of course, deals with the compliance with the rules of natural justice. But as I said earlier, in the context of delegated legislation, natural justice may not have much of a role to play because unlike administrative action, there is no requirement of compliance with the rules of natural justice when you're framing a rule or a regulation, unless the parent statute expressly says that you have to do it.
But which are those instances where the concept of notice is read into the rule? There are some instances.
The Motor Vehicles Act. Motor Vehicles Act says, for example, that before you come out with a scheme, the state government has to actually notify draft scheme, call for objections, and then only notify the action scheme. That would be a classic case where
instances where courts have read into the rule concept of notice.
They cannot. No, they cannot. They cannot. They should not. Because I'm using the word cannot because of the practical instances that we find. Ideally, they should not, because legislation, when it comes, just as you would not read natural justice into legislation, it would not be read into even the delegated legislation.
Yes.
On the simple principle that you cannot attribute malefides to legislation.
Right.
Right. Now, proportionality, and this is a concept that evolved subsequently in administrative law generally, and even in the context of delegated legislation. Proportionality deals with striking down of a delegated legislation on the ground that while the delegate might have been justified in making a rule, the rule is disproportionate in its treatment to certain categories of persons, and that disproportionality is frowned upon by the judiciary, and the rule is read down to that extent. A classic case, and a very recent one, 2020, is Justice Nariman's judgment recently in the cryptocurrencies case. What happened was the RBI issued a circular in exercise of the powers under the relevant statute. The RBI issued a circular directing all the banking institutions to refrain from dealing with those companies which were engaged in cryptocurrencies. Now the question was the RBI justified in bringing out a circular? Of course, the question, there's a larger question as to whether the circular itself is a delegated legislation or not. Let us take for a moment, because if you read the passages in the judgment, the presumption seems to be that the circular is an act of the delegate, which is the RBI, in accordance with the power conferred under the statute. So we will say that the circular is an instrument of delegated legislation. Fair enough. Now, once the circular came in, you see what the impact of the circular is on the persons to whom it is addressed. The circular was to deal with the RBI's power to regulate money. Question was whether virtual currencies or cryptocurrencies answered the definition of money. The Supreme Court said, and Justice Nariman said, yes, because it answers the definition of a medium of exchange, or it has the attributes of a medium of exchange, a unit of account, a store of value, and an instrument of final discharge of a standard of deferred payment. So these are the four tests that you apply for the principle for determining whether a particular unit can be treated as money for the purposes of our economy. Justice Nariman found that cryptocurrencies also answered the definition, and therefore said that the RBI had the power, and to that extent the circular, even if it was delegated legislation, was a valid one. There was no excessive delegation. But then came the question of proportionality, and there the court said that it failed the test of proportionality, because the measure, you have to, for determining whether it is a proportionate exercise of power, you need to look at whether the measure that is adopted is designated for the proper purpose. Secondly, is it rationally connected to the fulfillment of that purpose? Third, is there no other alternative or lesser invasive method for interfering with the business activities? And fourth, is there a proper relationship between the importance of of achieving the aim and importance of limiting the right? So essentially what they are saying is, could you have gone in for a less draconian measure to achieve the object which you sought to achieve through the circular in question? And the answer to that was found in the first proposition, saying that if you are treating virtual currencies, and if virtual currencies actually answer the definition of money, which the RBI can regulate, it was found that the RBI did not have any other material to take the decision to stop dealing in virtual currency, because there was no material available to the RBI which showed that this would be deleterious or this would harm the economy of our country. So on the test of proportionality, the circular failed, and therefore the circular to that extent was struck down. The citation is, for those of you who have Supreme Court online, to 2020 SCC online, SC for Supreme Court, page 275. The decision is called Internet and Mobile Association of India versus RBI. Internet and Mobile Association of India versus RBI. Right. Now, let me share with you some of my concerns now, which is more, which is what I need to pick your brains on. You see, judicial review of legislative or administrative action in our country is always a secondary review. And by secondary review, we mean that you wait for the original authority to act first, and the judiciary reviews the action taken by the original authority. Whether it comes to when you're whether you're reviewing a quasi-judicial action, a quasi-legislative action, or a or a purely administrative action, you wait for the you wait for the authority on whom the statute confers the power to act first, and the judiciary has to wait for that action to happen and then test the legality in a secondary review. This is what we mean by secondary review. Now you may ask, what is primary review? A primary review is where, see, a secondary review is where you look at the action taken by the primary authority and you see whether he has acted within the range of possibilities that he can act in. If he has done that, simply because there is an alternate view which you think is right, you do not interfere. This is secondary review. Primary review is where you find, for example, there is a patent, the view adopted by the original authority patently affronts or goes against the principles of under the constitution, it violates fundamental rights, etc. Discrimination, for example. If that is so, then you don't look at whether the primary authority had an alternate view. You substitute that view because you're armed with the constitutional principles and the fundamental rights.
So preemptive action, proactive.
Correct. Proactive action, and you step into the shoes of the adjudicator or the administrative authority and you take the decision yourself. This is secondary review. Now, my concern today is, in those instances where we are supposed to go in for a secondary review, what happens when the primary authority does not act at all? This is I'm sorry to say this is a growing tendency in our society, in our organs of governance today, because more and more and rising are the instances where people come to court for no other reason than the administrative quasi-judicial authority or the quasi-legislative authority has not acted.
Or inaction.
Inaction. And this is dangerous because if it is not to, it may sound very encouraging or intoxicating for a judge to be told that, they have not acted, only your lordship can act. For somebody, if you suffer from megalomania, then you will think that, you're running the whole country, judiciary steps in, and we hear this all the time. So when persons come and say that you're the last resort, you must function, you're ignoring one basic principle. If the judiciary were to perform the functions of all the organs of governance, you, by encouraging that, will effectively be rendering otiose or dysfunctional the other limbs of governance, the legislature as also the executive. And that is wholly undesirable. And we have seen growing instances of legislative inaction. I'm sorry to say, the development of this law in our country is largely at the expense of bringing about a non-functioning or a dysfunction of the other organs of governance.
Stalemate.
Look at some examples, and this is my favorite example. Look at what happened in a field of law, for example, where the legislature was to act. We are talking about the Vishaka case. 1996 was the Vishaka case, if I'm not mistaken. Supreme Court laid down guidelines with regard to a very important aspect that was noticed in our society and an evil that was noticed in our society, which is sexual harassment of women at their workplace. This was an evil that had to be addressed. Now, it's not as though there were no provisions under the criminal law for dealing with the thing, with the evil, but it was felt that this required a particular emphasis because of the growing instances that were found, and you needed to treat this as a separate crime or a separate offense and deal with it through a specified procedure, special procedure, considering the nature of the victim invariably. So the Supreme Court laid down the guidelines in Vishaka in 1996. There is a salient observation in the Supreme Court judgment saying that these guidelines are to endure only till such time as the legislature brings out a law to address the problem. 1996 was the Supreme Court guidelines. When did the legislature come out? 2013, if I'm not mistaken. If it takes 17 years for the legislature to act, this is a very sorry state of affairs, and this is not isolated. So the case of Vishaka is not the single isolated instance where legislature has failed to act in time.
Smoking in public place.
Smoking in public place, we still have a problem.
They came out with a law.
Correct, but similarly for PUCL, the People's Union of Civil Liberties, dealing with food security laws. Judgment was in 2000, we had the legislation in 2010. So if this is the kind of lag that is going to happen, you already have a legislative body which is not properly functioning. And added to that, if you have a system where they don't act at all and the judiciary condones it by reading in or discharging the functions of the legislature, we are in serious trouble. Because we are already dealing with courts which are overburdened with work. And you will lead to a situation where the work is overwhelming and it will lead to the crumbling of the last bastion of hope for many, which is the last democratic institution which most people rely on. So that is a tendency which needs to be curbed. Now, in the specific context of delegated legislation, what I find a little disturbing is that the courts seem to be ready and willing to uphold the delegation of even essential legislative functions by reading in the justification wherever such excessive delegation happens and the delegate actually comes out with a rule. It may fail all the recognized tests of excessive delegation, but the judiciary of late, it's not of late, it's a phenomenon that started in the 70s, seems to be willing to read in the power of delegation into some innocuous words in the statute. For example, I'll give you those examples. Let me just take you to two cases which will glaringly give you the contrast. The first is a case called Jalan Trading Company versus Mill Mazdoor Sabha. Jalan Trading Company versus Mill Mazdoor Sabha. It's a decision of 1967. Citation is AIR 1967, Supreme Court 691. AIR 1967, Supreme Court 691. Now look at the facts of that case. It's under the Payment of Bonus Act 1965. There was a provision where the central government could by an order, provide for the removal of doubts or difficulties in giving effect to the provisions of the Act. It's a very simple provision. It looks very innocuous. Now, what does it actually do? Under Section 37, you're giving a power to the central government that whenever there is a confusion with regard to what the objects of the Act are, the central government will clarify what the legislature wanted. Now, this was obviously struck down. The Supreme Court said in 1967 that this provision is ultra vires. It suffers from excessive delegation because you are asking the central government, which is the delegate, to tell you what the objects of the statute are. Unheard of. Because the delegate is supposed to know what the objects of the statute are, because that is an essential legislative function. Prescribing the objects of the statute, prescribing the policy that informs the statute, etc. So, when that power is delegated to the delegate, it is a clear case of excessive delegation. Now look at the next case. It's called Avinder Singh versus State of Punjab. And this is 1979, 1 SCC 137. 1979, 1 SCC 137. Now that was a case which came under the Punjab Municipal Corporations Act 1976. You had a provision there which said the state of Punjab can require the various municipal bodies in the state to impose a tax at the rate of ₹1 per bottle in respect of foreign liquor. Now the municipalities refused to take any action. So the state government directly took action. And they imposed this ₹1 per bottle on all the foreign liquor. The imposition of the tax was challenged before the court. One of the contentions taken was the power given to the state government to levy this fee of ₹1 per bottle on foreign liquor is given without any guidance as to what are the circumstances under which it can act and what are the circumstances under which the levy can be imposed. And now the Supreme Court says the parent statute used the words for the purposes of the act, that the state government or the delegate could impose a levy of fee to further the purposes of the act, and therefore that was enough safeguard for the state government to act as a delegate for imposition of the fee. Now, however much I look at it, I cannot find a distinction between the earlier case of Jalan Trading and the subsequent case of Avinder Singh when it comes to the interpretation of the words for the purposes of the act. In one case, they said you cannot have a delegate determining what the purposes of the act are. And in the other case, you have the Supreme Court saying precisely the opposite, saying that it is open to the delegate to say what the purposes of the act are. Now, if this second view, and fortunately there was a dissent in the second by one of the judges, but of course it didn't carry. The difficulty I have with this is if you have a delegate acting under a provision which is expressly bad because of excessive legislation, and the safeguards of delegated legislation, the limitations that we place on delegated legislations are there because we want to uphold the grander principle of separation of powers and to ensure that legislation is done only by the legislature. Then by interpreting or being ready to interpret the provisions of a statute to justify an excessive legislation by some means would only lead to a situation where you will have a shoddy legislations coming out in droves. So this is not something that we can put up with. And therefore, I sincerely hope that in future, if you want to have studied legislation, if you want to have proper legislation and a proper exercise of the legislative power, we don't have interpretations which would be conducive to making the legislature a lazy body. The second area of concern for me is with regard to the provision of laying. Now, this is again an area where you have divergent views with regard to the requirement of laying of a subordinate rule before the legislature. Now, as I said earlier, the very requirement of laying the instrument before the parent legislative body is for the legislative body to actually see whether the exercise of delegated power has been in a proper manner or not. This is, as I said, it's a legislative safeguard of the delegated legislation. Now, in cases, in the case of Atlas Cycle Industries versus State of Haryana, 1979 2 SCC 196. 1979 2 SCC 196. If you look at that case law, and I won't go into the facts because I think I'm running out of time. If you look at that case law, you're essentially seeing a departure from the erstwhile rules where the Supreme Court would necessarily read in as mandatory the requirement of laying, because the importance of laying this rule before the legislature was seen as the necessity of laying the rules was seen as very important. But today, you're seeing that there is the interpretation is that some of these rules which are required to be laid, they say is only directory, not mandatory. I would think that when the legislature, because you see this fundamentally goes against the principle, settled principle of interpretation of statutes, which is that when a statute prescribes a method of doing such a thing, it shall be done in that manner and no other. It goes back to Nasser and Emperor, 1942 Privy Council. If that is the principle, salutary principle of interpretation of statutes, how do you read a statutory provision which says that the rules shall be placed before the legislature in any other way other than shall, mandatory? But the decision seems to go on the principle that it is only directory, and therefore it is protecting the legislature or protecting the delegated legislation with the view to protect the delegated legislation from lapsing. The courts have been willing to read in a principle that it is only directory and not mandatory. Now, this may be good as a strategy for a given case or a given period, when you feel that if you strike down the subordinate legislation, it would require a fresh exercise to be done and therefore delay and urgent matters. But you cannot act on, you cannot lay down a blanket proposition in a case which has got only a limited operation. So these tendencies, according to me, need to be checked. And if our law is to develop, it would be desirable that the control over delegated legislation is not confined only to judicial control, but more and more emphasis given to legislative control itself, so that the legislative body itself, which conferred the power, is given an opportunity to correct any excesses at that stage before it goes into the realm of judicial control. That brings me to the end of my talk, and I think I have mentioned the concerns that I have, and I'm willing to take any questions. Before I conclude, I did come across a question which was sent to me with regard to the wages
code on wages.
Code on wages, and I think I may have covered that position when I drew the distinction between the delegated legislation and conditional legislation.
Correct.
Because the provision that was brought to my notice was a provision which authorized the central government to fix the rate, the percentage of the wages that would be excluded from the definition of wages for the purposes of the Act. Now there, it is a clear case of conditional legislation, where the legislation is complete in all aspects by the legislature. The limited power given to the central government is only to fix a particular rate of the excluded component. So the distinction between conditional legislation and delegated legislation would answer that question.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And apart from Justice Hariprasad and Justice Ramkumar, sir, we recognize the presence of Chidambaresh, sir. Justice Chidambaresh is also have been throughout the talk present.
I see.
And now, sir, before we go to the open forum, couple of questions that has come up.
Yeah.
Number one is that overburdening of the judiciary on account of the deficiencies and inadequacies, or rather the way in which the delegated legislation, the machinery, or it being legislation being done, implemented. A question that has been put up is that could we not insist on subcommittees or expert committees to assist the legislature rather than it being given to an executive body which even otherwise may be inefficient or insufficient?
Absolutely.
While lawmaking, they do that.
Correct.
Subject committee, select committee, etc.
No.
Referring to
also
while
the-
making the law, main
Correct.
statute, but not in the subordinate legislation.
Yes, Mr. Ramkumar would know because he was a law secretary also. And
Correct.
and
I know what the legislature in its wisdom, what exactly is happening. I know.
what they don't teach you in law school.
Sir, we have Kiran Verma. He has raised his hand. Kiran, are you there? You can put a question. Kiran? Or should I read out what he has put here? He has put, Kiran, are you there? If you can ask for yourself, it
Hello,
would be better.
hello.
Yeah, Kiran, yeah, of course. Go ahead, shoot.
Sir, I would like Honorable Justice Nambiar to elaborate on the case law of A.R. Kraipak versus Union of India. It was based on delegated legislation. A.R. Kraipak versus Union of India.
Kraipak is authority for the proposition of introduction of the rules of natural justice.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Natural justice may not have much of a role to play in the delegated legislation, which is why I avoided Kraipak here. I would have talked about Kraipak in the context of challenge to administrative orders or quasi-judicial orders on the ground of violation of natural justice. But when it comes to legislation, the requirement of natural justice cannot be read in unless the parent statute requires that before implementing or before bringing out a rule or a regulation, you need to comply with the rules of natural justice, either by way of consultation or hearing the affected parties. So Kraipak may not have any relevance in the context of delegated legislation.
Very well, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. Now, having not entered the name, it is SG what is written. He has made a statement. Can SG come forward and say that, or should I read that? SG. Kerala Samsthana Chettutozhilali Union case he has mentioned. Can you please identify yourself, Mr. SG?
No,
Hello.
the Kerala Samsthana Chettutozhilali Union case is the one which lays down all the principles of challenge of delegated legislation under the various heads. It gives
Hello. By Srijagan sir, I believe.
Yeah, it was just, hello.
Yes.
Namaskaram, this is Sandeep Gopalakrishnan. I was just referring to that, the principle that an act, a delegated legislation should also be in line with the other plenary legislation.
Yes.
This was the judgment which was actually referred to. Apart from
right. Both, yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. Samsthana Chettutozhilali Union also referred to that, and so did another case which I'm forgetting the name of it. Apart from Chettutozhilali Union, yes, Kerala Samastha Chettutozhilali Union is 2006 4 SCC 327. 2006 4 SCC 327, and you would also find a reiteration in State of Tamil Nadu versus P. Krishnamurthy, which is 2006 4 SCC 517. 4 SCC 517. Both these cases and the earlier one of Sabhanayagam.
Right. Thank you, sir.
Sir, we have Askar KK clarifying that State of Tamil Nadu versus K. Sabhanayagam, and another is AR 1998 Supreme Court 344.
Is that Justice Jagannath Rao?
So that Askar, are you there?
Yes, rendered by Jagannath Rao.
Jagannath Rao, yes.
Correct. The corresponding SCC citation is 1998 Volume 1 SCC 318.
Okay.
Then we have Bhuvan Singh, can you just unmute yourself and put the question, please? Are you there, Bhuvan Singh? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. Yes, I'm here. Yes, sir. I just wanted to know if you could throw some light on this. When does an administrative order have the force of law, if it can be said to have the force of law? And would the administrative order need to prescribe some penal consequences as a necessary precondition? If you could.
No, I didn't get the first part of it. Administrative order having the force of law. What do you mean? I mean, there is. If it's an administrative authority and he passes an order.
And when I say administrative order, I mean a statutory body, like perhaps the Director General of Shipping, who is, I think, whose office comes under the
Merchant Shipping Act.
Yes.
He issues an executive order during the absence of rules.
Yes. If the statutory authority issuing an order acting on the powers of the statute, then
yes.
It can be challenged on the ground applicable to administrative orders.
I see.
If he is not empowered to pass an order, then you straight away you will impugn it anyway on the ground that it is ultra vires. He's acting outside the powers of the statute.
Right. Okay. Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So we have Renoy Vincent. Renoy, can you just put the question? Unmute yourself and put the question, please. Renoy Vincent.
So my question is that when we challenge the virus of a statute, the principle, the doctrine of presumption of constitutionality comes into play.
Yes.
So when we challenge the validity of a delegated legislation, so will the same doctrine apply in the same vigor, or is it not applicable at all? So that is my question.
There is a presumption of intra vires, no?
There is a presumption of constitutionality in any challenge in our country.
So, and intra vires.
Intra vires is like presumption of constitutionality. So when you're challenging delegated legislation, you will challenge it on the ground either of excessive delegation, or if it is not excessive delegation, you would challenge it on the ground of the recognized principles of ultra vires. If the authority is acting well within its powers, then you are challenging the action of the authority who is acting within powers, and to see whether he has acted illegally, irrationally, whether he has violated any procedure, and lastly, the proportionality. So this is the order in which you mount the challenge. But just to clarify on your question, the problem seems to be for most people to identify whether a particular order or a rule or a regulation is actually a delegated legislation or is it just an administrative order. The difference is crucial, because if it is a delegated legislation, one of the grounds on which you can challenge it is gone from you, which is the principles of violation of natural justice. If it is not a delegated legislation, you can straight away bring in that argument also, because invariably these will be cases where you have not been heard, or where there has been no opportunity given to you to confront you with the materials which have been used against you. So that distinction is critical, and most people just ignore it.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, we have Nitin with an interesting question. Nitin, can you just...
Namaskar, sir. This is Nitin from Mumbai.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. This is regarding the quasi-judicial authority. Sir, quasi-judicial authority, many a times they are going beyond the power which have been vested upon them by the statute. As you rightly pointed out, in case of quasi-legislative authority, there will be checked initially by the legislature, because they will lay down the rules.
Correct.
So in certain cases, apart from filing the writ petition or preferring an appeal, is there any other remedy available to us so that we can keep them under the control? Because I've come across such case wherein the real estate regulatory authority, they are going beyond the power which is not vested upon them. So unfortunately, we have to file a writ petition in that case. So do we have anything like that, as you have mentioned, for quasi-legislative?
Unfortunately,
keep them in
no.
control. Thank you, sir.
You have either a statutorily provided mechanism, or you come to the High Court. In fact, I think most lawyers would be happy if there's no statutory authority, because that's the first test that we use to drive them out of the High Court. The existence of an alternate remedy.
So, I mean,
Thank you very much, sir.
thank you. Do we have any other further questions regarding this? I don't find Harish. Yeah, please go ahead. You'll have to unmute yourself, Harish.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Sir, now the Chief Labour Commissioner of Kerala has issued a circular in the under the Epidemic Disease Ordinance Act, empowering or giving right to the employees to get full salary from the employees. Is it something which is excessive delegation?
I choose not to answer that question because you could well be for me in the next question.
We may even cite this is now. Prem, anything to be added on that?
Nothing. It was really very good exposition of the subject, and with his lordship's what I call the oratory pyrotechnics also. It was exceptionally good.
Thank you very much.
Yet another forensic treat.
Thank you.
We have been fortunate to have such, I would say, exposition of law and the way in which it is being presented and the kind of audience. We have a splendid audience here. If I am to mention, I'll have to mention each and every one of the participants because they are all exceptional lawyers and persons in this field. So tomorrow,
Ramkumar's comment on I always take with a pinch of salt because the last time he made such a comment was when I argued a labour matter before him and Justice Barkat Ali. They were sitting in division bench. And there was Justice Mr. Nandakumar Veran and me arguing a proposition of labour law and a question of disciplinary inquiry before Justice Ramkumar. And he wrote a judgment which ran into something close to 90 pages. It even had an index. And the last paragraph, he paid huge encomiums to me, and he said, if I'm not mistaken, the very same sentence. And he said, this is a brilliant exposition, a forensic analysis of the law. And he decided it was against me.
Operation successful, but the patient died.
Yes, patient died.
Wonderful, sir. Wonderful. So, sir, it was, in fact, really wonderful to have you with us today. And we even released the time when you were with us the other couple of days also during the presentations by others. Tomorrow we have Justice Hari Prasad with on the topic adverse possession. He had to leave just before the question answer session. He just sent a message that he's have to leave for some, I don't know. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Shaban. I'm really happy that you're having such a thing because it's always a pleasure to interact with lawyers and law students. And I always, even though, I mean, I've always seen myself as a student of law, no matter what position I occupy. And I think it is important that as students of law, we keep a pulse, we keep a finger on the academic development also, because academia and academics would tell you what the law is going to be 5 years from now. And I think we need to understand that either to steer away from that path of disaster or go towards that desirable path. So an academic
sorry sir, if I can just interrupt, a couple of hands have come up. Can I have the privilege of requesting them to put the questions? Just a minute or so. Can I? Okay, it is number one is Ravikiran Kendre. I hope I pronounced your name correct. Ravi, hello.
Yes, sir. You have pronounced properly, sir.
Please.
Sir, some poor person can go in a high court. He can't pay minimum amount to the lawyer. Then what's have chance?
If you want to come, you can come directly. You can appear party in person.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
You don't require a lawyer.
In Supreme Court, sir, there are
you're better off in the Supreme Court, Article 32.
Beyond the subject.
This is ultra wise the delegation. So we have Advocate P.T. Mohan Kumar. Mohan Kumar, sir.
Your Lordship, it's so excellent that presentation. My doubt was also answered. But one more, with respect to Code of Wages, I'm just repeating. I'm sorry for the question is only this. Because 67 and 68 of Code of Wages, we find a very interesting provision. 67(3) that the power of the central government for rule making. And 68(1), there is the power conferred on the central government
to prescribe the percentage.
No, not that. That is for remedial or rather interpretation or for remedial rules. Powers are given under section 68. So when power to remove difficulties under the heads, can a statute give such a leverage to the such a long rope to the executive to interpret the statute? So
theoretically, it should not. Which is why I referred to the case of Jalan trading, where Jalan trading was a clear case where the Supreme Court itself has said that you cannot ask the delegate to be deciding on the policy, etc., or the purposes of the act. But yet, in Avinder Singh in 1979, 12 years later, they took a contrary stand, and I'm not happy with that development, because I believe that if the legislature has to delegate, then the delegation must be with all the necessary material that would inform the delegate as to what the objects are and how he should exercise the power.
So power to
in a country like India, we need a proper delegation with all the contours and limitations specified. If you leave it to the because we have to take note of, it cannot be a cut and paste exercise for legislation.
Exactly.
You can't take legislation from Britain and impose it in India. The societal circumstances, etc., are entirely different, and that is why even in the interpretation of our constitution, we don't simply, although our constitution contains principles or provisions which have been borrowed from US and Ireland, when we implement or when we interpret the constitution, it is always to be in the background of the social circumstances prevailing in India, and of course interpreted in a transformative manner. But it can't be left to the delegate to determine what the policy of the legislature is.
So the power to remove difficulties is the function of the legislature.
Correct.
But we come across such rules in various statutes. Whenever there is a doubt, it shall be referred to the central government.
It is more or less like a Henry VIII clause. But Henry VIII clause, but certain aspects of Henry VIII clause are also beneficial. As I said, it's a necessary evil, because if you want to amend the legislation, it is a cumbersome process, and therefore more and more statutes have resorted to the procedure of getting a clarification done through one of the recognized bodies.
Thank you, sir. There is Advocate Vishwanathan. Please, Vishwanathan, sir.
Yes, good evening, sir. Thank
Yeah,
you.
please.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, of course, nothing to ask about anything. It was an inspiring session. That's what I wanted to. It was an inspiring session.
Oh,
that's what I want to remark.
Compliments and encomiums.
Thank you. Now we have Sandhya Ram. Sandhya Ram, you got something? You put your hand up, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Thank you, sir. It was quite helpful and very illustrative. Now my query, can you hear me, sir?
I can hear you.
Yeah, my question is with respect to, as you have rightly pointed out, the classification of administrative action that makes a very crucial point in determining, especially when it comes to applicability of the principles of natural justice. So far the courts have been going by the generality test, the prospectivity test in distinguishing between the judicial and the legislative functions. However, this judgment in Schedule Caste and Weaker Sections Welfare Association versus State of Karnataka, that was post-2000 judgment, where they did not actually go by any standards. They just decided to hold a notification to be a quasi-judicial function, which was like regarding a slum clearance matter. It is just a notification which, first of all, informed them that a particular area in the slum would be coming under the category of slum clearance, which was beneficial to the residents there. And later the notification was changed. And the court said that hearing has to be given to them because it's not about whether it is QL or QJ. It's all about whether rights of the parties are affected or not.
Exactly. That's
So when
the
courts
test.
are
Because
taking,
see, the basic differences between quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial is that when it comes to quasi-judicial, it always involves the balancing of or determination or adjudication of inter se rights of people. So if there is an element of if there is an element in the exercise of power which involves the balancing of rights of people and a prejudice consequent to the exercise of power that would affect certain people or the rights of certain people, then irrespective of what you call it, we don't go by the nomenclature. In essence, it is a quasi-judicial function. And the minute it falls under that bracket, you apply the tests of natural justice. Because now, when it comes to principles of natural justice, following Kraipak and other decisions, the distinction between quasi-judicial and administrative, etc., is blurred. So, in fact, non-existent.
So will malice also step in tomorrow? Like, will malified be, or are there cases where malified is used in case of a delegated legislation?
Malifieds in delegated legislation, no, because just as in legislation. But in an indirect way, you could say that because suppose you were to classify the or describe the legislation as unreasonable because inter alia of a malified exercise of power, it results in an unreasonable legislation. Unreasonableness has now been recognized as a ground of challenge for legislations also.
Okay, so using 14, it is possible.
Yes, under Article 14 also it would now be possible because after the decisions of the Supreme Court in
Triple Talaq.
The Triple Talaq case and also subsequently Justice Nariman again in the subsequent cases, including the privacy case.
Yes,
so you would now get that window also for challenge.
Yes. Thank you, sir.
So, sir, thank you very much, and I hope there are no further clarifications required. Yes. So,
thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. So, till we meet again tomorrow.
Yes.
Take care. Stay safe.
Okay.